the police and protesters, even as police try and disperse those crowds that are slowly building up. Of course, we continue doing a spot check of what exactly is happening, not only in Nairobi, but we'll be crossing over live to Nyeri, as well as Kakamega, Kisumu, Mombasa. And of course, we saw in Mombasa, those protests started at around 10 a.m. And the clarion call from the protesters is they're asking the government of the day, led by President William Ruto, to leave office so that they can get better leaders, according to what they say, leaders who can provide and give good governance and govern this country as it should. All this we're seeing from the ground. I just want us to listen to what exactly is happening there in Nairobi CBD, as you're seeing there police officers just trying to prepare themselves. Those trying to find out what exactly they're using, whether those are live bullets or they're rubber bullets, as they try to disperse those crowds. Let's just listen in briefly before we come back. All right, that is the situation on the ground. There are live pictures we're seeing from Nairobi CBD. We've seen there police officers engage protesters, police officers lobbying tear gas canisters towards protesters. And this is despite that High Court ruling that we saw last week. We saw Justice Mugure Thande bar police from using water cannons, tear gas, live and rubber bullets or other crude weapons to disperse protesters. Remember, the High Court equally barred them from abductions. Things that we're seeing clearly, violation of the court order. As you can see live pictures on your screen there, police officers using tear gas to disperse protesters. As you can see, there are live pictures, stones all over the road. Fires lit here in Nairobi CBD. We spoke last to Daniel Kariuki, and he was mentioning this was along Tomboya Street, if I'm not wrong. And as you can see, there are protesters are trying to make their way into the CBD, but police officers are trying to block them from accessing the CBD. And that is why we're seeing that back and forth between police officers and protesters. Earlier on, we did find out that a majority of business in the CBD were closed. Of course, we saw around 90% of businesses in the CBD closed. Equally, we saw PSV operators, saying that they're going to take a back seat just to, wait and see how exactly the day will pan out when it comes to protest, in order to avoid destruction of property and them making losses. So that is the situation. We equally spoke to Jeff Mogire, who is joining us live from Wayakiwe, specifically Kangemi. And the situation is the same, with protesters saying that, they're out there fighting for their future. They're out there because they're unemployed and they lack employment. And they're asking the government of the day not to just hear them, but listen to what they're saying. They want better governance. These are issues that they're fighting for. But just to give a recap of how exactly we got to this specific point where we are as a country. Remember, these particular protests was sparked by the Finance Bill 2024 that was withdrawn by President William Ruto. But before that, we saw on Tuesday, Kenyan protesters, broke their way through Parliament, and the barricades that were set in place last week on Tuesday. There you can see pictures, running battles. People are trying to just escape, avoid being injured by either tear gas canisters or bullets that would be used by those police officers to try and disperse the crowds. But as you can see on your screen, majority of the businesses there are closed, even as Nairobi CBD is engulfed by a cloud of tear gas smoke. Now, back to what I was informing you about, how we got to this particular point. Last week, we saw the biggest protest we've ever seen in this country so far. Later that evening, we saw, actually in the afternoon, we saw protesters make their way into Parliament precincts. We saw damage happening in Parliament building, the Parliament building, with windows being shattered, as well as, protesters making their way all through inside the Parliament, where they went all the way to, the mess. And we saw members of Parliament find their way out, trying to rush out, avoiding protesters, using that tunnel that is supposed to link the Parliament buildings with Bunge Tower. But later that afternoon, we equally saw Defense CS, that is Eden Duale, gazette the deployment of the KDF without the approval of the National Assembly then. And according to that gazette notice, the KDF were meant to support the Kenya Police Service to restore normalcy across the country. That particular Tuesday, that is last week, later that night, we saw President William Ruto come out to address the nation. And what the president did, describe the events that took place during the day, talked about the breach of Parliament, which he termed it as treasonous. You can see there live pictures on your screen. Protesters, together with police officer, protester is being forced into that police lorry, I guess, to be arrested. As you can see there, the police officers mishandling that protester, even as he tries to avoid being arrested by those police officers. But back to what the president did mention last week. The president vowed to crack down on the organizers and financiers of the protest, which entered their fifth day then, that is last week. And according to the head of state, he did mention that criminals had hijacked a critical conversation, causing havoc throughout the country, and of course that Parliament breach that we saw. Now, we equally saw a tough-talking President William Ruto promise a full and prompt response to Tuesday's events to ensure that such an event did not occur again. And of course, later on, that is Wednesday, the following day, we saw members of parliament approve the deployment of the KDF officers within the country in order to restore order after deadly protests that were witnessed on Tuesday. So this is how far we've come along as a country. We've seen, of course, this protest that started 2 weeks ago that had a build-up to last week, where we saw the biggest protest, the magnitude of the protesters that came out in large numbers, protesters that managed to overpower police officers in order to find a way inside Parliament. And this happened, actually, the protesters managed to breach Parliament a few minutes after the members of Parliament had passed that Finance Bill 2024, which